Okay. 23. We're going to continue. We're reading the Holy Bible, the Old Testament, the book of 1 Samuel. We're going to continue from chapter 23. And in case anybody's wondering what translation this is, at this time, I'm reading the Good News translation. But I do switch every now and then, so let's see. I'm just looking at my notes. Okay, no problem. We'll start here. David heard that the Philistines were attacking the town of Keilah and were stealing the newly harvested grain. Now, so here alone, I got to tell you something real quick right here. I'll even read this again. David heard. Now, why would David hear this? The reason I'm telling you is the town of Keilah should be taken care of by King Saul. He should be taking care of the situation. As a king, Saul had the duty to protect Keilah, but he was not fulfilling his duty. So the people turned to David. So now here we go. David heard that the Philistines were attacking the town of Keilah and were stealing the newly harvested grain. So he asked the Lord, "Shall I go and attack the Philistines?" "Yes," the Lord answered, "attack them and save Keilah." But David's men said to him, "We have enough to be afraid of here in Judah. It'll be much worse if we go to Keilah and attack the Philistine forces." So David consulted the Lord again, and the Lord said to him, "Go and attack Keilah, because I will give you victory over the Philistines." So it's kind of sad that David's own men advised him not to rescue Keilah, but so let's continue. 5. So David and his men went to Keilah and attacked the Philistines. They killed many of them and took their livestock, and so it was that David saved the town. When Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, escaped and joined David in Keilah, he took the ephod with him. So we have a little situation right here in what's going on. Remember Abiathar, by the way? Remember when Doeg, that henchman for Saul, went and killed all the priests in the city of Nob? Abiathar was the only one that was able to escape. So, here he is. The good thing is he took the ephod with him, the breastpiece that they used to talk to God. So that's good. So just a little bit here. Keilah was a border town in Judah. It was about 12 miles from the Philistine city of Gath, where Goliath was originally from, and about 10 miles west of the forest of Hereth, where David and his men were hiding out. Situated that close to the enemy, Keilah was extremely vulnerable, especially during the harvest season when the Philistine army was searching for food. If King Saul had been concerned about defending his people, he would have sent a group of soldiers to protect Keilah, but instead he was so obsessed with finding David and killing him. So the spies of both David and Saul were active in the land, and David's spies reported that the Philistines were attacking Keilah. There's a lot of snitches back in those days. David paused to determine the will of God, a practice every leader needs to imitate, for it is easy for our own personal interests to get in the way of God's will. How did David discover God's will when Abiathar the priest had not yet arrived in the camp? The prophet Gad was with David, and it's likely that he prayed to the Lord for direction. Once Abiathar arrived with the ephod, David had him inquire of the Lord, where there was important decisions to be made. So once David got the go-ahead signal from the Lord, he mobilized his men, right? But they were not too enthusiastic about this plan, like I told you earlier. It was acceptable to fight the Philistines, Israel's longtime enemies, but they did not want to fight their own Jewish brothers, Saul's people. What if Saul turned against David and his men? The band of 600 men would then be caught between two armies. Unwilling to impose his own idea on his men, David sought the Lord's will a second time, and once again he was told to go rescue the people of Keilah. It wasn't David's unbelief that created the problem because he had faith in the Lord, but it was the fear in the hearts of his men that made them unprepared for battle. So, long story short, God more than kept his promise because he not only helped David slaughter the invading Philistines, but also take a great amount of spoil from them. David moved into Keilah, which was a walled city, and it was there that Abiathar went when he fled from Nob, carrying the precious ephod. This is from last chapter. But Saul's spies were at work. Like I said, a lot of snitches in those days. But Paul's spies were at work and learned that David was now in Keilah, a walled city with gates. Saul told his troops they were going to Keilah to rescue the city. But his real purpose was to capture David. And he was certain that David could not escape. It was a city with a big wall around it. Saul was not only willing to slaughter the priest of Nob, but he would have destroyed his own people in the city of Keilah just to lay hands on David. So what I'm trying to say is people who are controlled by malice and hatred quickly lose their perspective and begin to abuse their authority. Okay, now a couple of things here. Let me see. Yes, let's go to next one, 7. Okay, Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, God has put him in my power. David has trapped himself by going into a walled town with fortified gates. So, in other words, when David was at Keilah, Saul thought, and this is so twisted, Saul thought God had delivered David into his hands. Saul was so delusional that he thought God was helping him hunt, capture, and kill David. 8. So Saul called his troops to war to march against Keilah and besiege David and his men. So Saul was assuming that just because someone was an enemy of Saul, they were an enemy of God as well. Like I say, he was paranoid, schizophrenic, and bipolar on top of all that. When David heard that Saul was planning to attack him, he said to the priest Abiathar, "Bring the ephod here." Then David said, "Lord, God of Israel, I've heard that Saul is planning to come to Keilah and destroy it on account of me, your servant. Will the citizens of Keilah hand me over to Saul? Will Saul really come as I have heard? Lord, God of Israel, I beg you to answer me." The Lord answered, "Saul will come. And will the citizens of Keilah hand me and my men over to Saul?" David asked again. "They will," the Lord answered. So David and his men, about 600 in all, left Keilah at once and kept on the move. When Saul heard that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up his plan. That's kind of messed up that the town that he has saved were willing to turn him in to Saul. 14. David in the hill country. David stayed in hiding in the hill country, in the wilderness near Ziph. Saul was always trying to find him, but God did not turn David over to him. David saw that Saul was out to kill him. David was at Horesh in the wilderness near Ziph. Jonathan went to him there and encouraged him with assurance of God's protection, saying to him, "Don't be afraid. My father Saul will not be able to harm you. He knows very well that you are the one who will be the king of Israel, and that I will be next in rank to you." The two of them made a sacred promise of friendship to each other. David stayed at Horesh while Jonathan went home. Let's see. So there's a couple of things here to mention. David's spies quickly let him know that Saul was planning to come to Keilah. So with Abiathar's help, David sought the Lord's guidance. His great concern was whether the people of Keilah would turn him and his men over to Saul. Since David had rescued the city from the Philistines, you would have expected the citizens to be grateful and to protect David, right? But such was not the case. The Lord warned David to get out of the city because the people were prepared to turn him over to the king. No doubt the people of Keilah were afraid that if they did not cooperate with Saul, he would massacre them, as he did the people of Nob. David recalled how pained he was because of the tragedy at Nob, and he didn't want another city wiped out because of him. He led his men out, and they kept moving from place to place, verse 13, until they settled in the wilderness of Ziph. So when Saul got the word that David had left Keilah, he called off the attack. But he still sought him day after day and neglected the important affairs of the kingdom. However, the Lord was on David's side and made sure that Saul was never successful in his quest. Now, something about this area of Ziph that I have to mention might be interesting to some of you. Ziph was a town 15 miles southeast of Keilah, in the wilderness of Ziph is what it's called, which was part of the wilderness of Judah. This is a very destitute area next to the Dead Sea, where David's faith and courage were greatly tested. If anybody goes there now, and just to visit as a tourist, when visitors to the Holy Land see this wilderness area, they often express amazement that David could have even survived living there. So David's beloved friend Jonathan risked his life to visit David in the wilderness and help him find strength in God. This was the last recorded meeting between Jonathan and David. Jonathan is not mentioned again in 1 Samuel until chapter 31, where we are told that he died on the battlefield. Jonathan had no idea that he would be slain before David became king, because he talked with David about their future co-regency and renewed with him the covenant that they had made in chapter 18 and chapter 20. He assured David that God would surely make him king in his good time, and that David would always be delivered from Saul's schemes to capture him. So Jonathan admitted that his father knew all these plans. 19, right over here. Some people from Ziph went to Saul at Gibeah and said, see, a bunch of snitches, man, and said, David is hiding out in our territory at Horesh on Mount Hakilah in the southern part of the Judean wilderness. We know, your majesty, how much you want to capture him. So come to our territory and we will make sure that you catch him. Saul answered, May the Lord bless you for being so kind to me. Go and make sure once more, find out for certain where he is and who has seen him there. I hear that he is very cunning. Find out exactly the places where he hides and be sure to bring back a report to me right away. Then I will go with you. And if he is still in the region, I will hunt him down, even if I have to search the whole land of Judah. So they left and returned to Ziph ahead of Saul. David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in a desolate valley in the southern part of the Judean wilderness. Saul and his men set out to look for David, but he heard about it and went to a rocky hill in the wilderness of Maon and stayed there. When Saul heard about this, he went after David. Saul and his men were on one side of the hill, separated from David and his men who were on the other side. They were hurrying to get away from Saul and his men, who were closing in on them and were just about to capture them. Just then, a messenger arrived and said to Saul, Come back at once. The Philistines are invading the country. So Saul stopped pursuing David and went to fight the Philistines. That is why that place is called Separation Hill. David left and went to the region of En-Gedi, where he stayed in hiding. So the Ziphites were not interested in following God's plan. Their great concern was to protect themselves from the rage of King Saul. They knew where David was hiding, so they conveyed this important information to Saul, carefully addressing him as king. This was their way of assuring him that they were loyal to him and not to David. Saul was still manipulating people by making them feel sorry for him. And this combination of building personal pity and having ruthless power seemed to be working. But Saul's character was deteriorating very quickly, while the Lord was molding David into a courageous man of God. So Saul was a good enough warrior to know that he couldn't find David in the wilderness of Judah without specific directions. So he asked the Ziphites to send him exact details. He wanted to know the hiding places in the rocks and the caves that David went to usually, and the hidden paths that he took. Once he had the map, Saul could search out the area and quickly find his enemy, David. But David also had spies working and knew that what Saul was doing, and the Lord was watching over the future king. So David moved out of the area of Ziph and 3 miles south into the wilderness of Maon. But Saul was not about to give up. No, 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 no. So he followed David into the wilderness of Maon. And the two armies met at a place called the Rock, a well-known mountain in the area. Saul divided his men, sent half around one side of the mountain and half around the other side. It was a pincer movement, a military tactic where you surround the enemy, one from the back, one from the front. This would have meant total defeat for David and his 600 soldiers. But guess what? The Lord was in control, and he brought the Philistines. Yes, the Lord brought the Philistines to attack somewhere in Judah, and Saul and his men had to abandon the attack. It was a close call for David, that's for sure, but God kept his promises. Now, to commemorate this great escape, the Jews called this place Sela Hamekeleloth, which means the rock of parting. The Hebrew carries the idea of a smooth rock, and therefore a slippery rock. In other words, the rock of slipping away. David quickly moved from Maon to En-Gedi, next to the Dead Sea. It was a place of safety with an ample water supply. Now, let's talk about a psalm real quick. David wrote Psalm 54 on this occasion, and in it, he prayed for salvation and vindication from the Lord. David knew that the flatterers in Saul's official circle, people like Doeg, were telling lies about him and making it look as though David wanted to kill the king. So these fawning people were hoping to be rewarded by Saul. So they only went down in defeat because they gave allegiance to the wrong king. Let's continue. Chapter 24, David spares Saul's life. So one thing real quick. David had prayed in Psalm 54 that the Lord will vindicate him and give him opportunity to prove to Saul that he was not an outlaw who was trying to kill him and take away his throne. After all, Saul was not only David's king, but he was also his commander and his father-in-law. And regardless of Saul's evil attitude, David never considered Saul to be his enemy. God answered David's prayer always when Saul and his troops came to find him at En-Gedi. So let's read chapter 24. Let me see. Okay. When Saul came back from fighting the Philistines, he was told that David was in the wilderness near En-Gedi. Saul took 3,000 of the best soldiers in Israel and went looking for David and his men east of Wild Goat Rocks. He came to a cave close to some sheep pens by the road and went in to relieve himself. It happened to be the very cave in which David and his men were hiding far back in the cave. They said to him, David's soldiers said to him, "This is your chance. The Lord has told you that he would put your enemy in your power, and you could do to him whatever you wanted to. David crept over and cut off a piece of Saul's robe without Saul's knowing it. So David and his men were hiding in a large cave, of which there were many in that area. Saul chose to use that very cave as a place where he could relieve himself, go to the bathroom. The law of Moses was very strict when it came to matters of sanitation, especially in the army camp. Deuteronomy chapter 23, by the way, if you want to read about this. Deuteronomy 23, verse 12 through 14. Each soldier was required to leave the camp to relieve himself, and he had to carry a small shovel or a trowel among his weapons so he could dig a hole and cover his excrement. This means that Saul was away from the camp and therefore quite vulnerable. He naturally wanted privacy, and he felt that he was not in danger. The fact that he walked right into David's hiding place not only proved that his spies were incompetent, but also that the Lord was still in control. So here's what happened. As David and his men pressed to the walls in the back of the cave, they quietly discussed the meaning of this remarkable occurrence. The men assured David that Saul's presence in the cave was a fulfillment of a promise that God gave him, that he would deliver Saul into David's hands. But when did God say this? Were they referring to Samuel's words and to Saul in 1 Samuel 15, or to God's message to Samuel in chapter 16? Perhaps the idea came from Jonathan's words in chapter 20, which some of the men might have heard personally. It's likely that the leaders of the 600 men discussed these matters among themselves, for their future was wrapped up in David's future, and obviously they came to some false conclusions. David never planned to kill Saul, for he was sure that the Lord would remove him from the scene in his own way and his own time. To David's men, though, it seemed providential that Saul was at their mercy, and both David and Saul agreed with them. But that wasn't the issue. The major question was, how does the Lord want us to use this occasion? David's men saw it as an opportunity for revenge, while David saw it as an opportunity to show mercy and prove that his heart was right. God was giving him an opportunity to answer his own prayer for vindication. Psalm 54, verse 1, once again. David stealthily crept up to the garment that Saul had laid aside. He cut off a corner of the robe and went back into the cave. Saul left the cave not realizing what had happened. Let's see. Okay, I want to make sure. Let's continue verse 5. But then David's conscience began to hurt, and he said to his men, "May the Lord keep me from doing any harm to my master, whom the Lord chose as king. I must not harm him in the least, because he is the king chosen by the Lord." So David convinced his men that they should not attack Saul. Saul got up, left the cave, and started away. Then David went out after him and called to him, "Your Majesty." This would have been a little awkward. See what happened there. Okay, so let's see here, want to make sure we don't miss anything. Okay, that's good. David was actually very wise in the truth of God's word to interpret this event as a signal for him to kill Saul. For the law says, remember, you shall not murder. Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. So killing enemies on the battlefield or in war or an attacker in self-defense was okay. That's one thing. But to assassinate an unsuspecting king was something quite different. David reminded his men that Saul was the anointed of the Lord and that no Jew had the right to attack him. The Jews were not even to curse the rulers, let alone kill them, for cursing a ruler was the same category as blaspheming the name of the Lord. However, David's conscience bothered him because this is kind of interesting. I don't know if you guys caught this. David's conscience had bothered him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. So this action sent out three messages. I don't know if you guys caught them. First, it was an insolent act of disrespect that humiliated Saul, for it was also a symbolic gesture, not unlike what Saul did to Samuel's robe after the Amalekite fiasco. Remember in 1 Samuel chapter 15? By cutting off a part of the royal robe, David was declaring that the kingdom had been transferred to him. Finally, the piece of cloth was proof that David did not intend to kill the king, and that the flatterers in the court were all liars. David's men would have killed Saul in a moment, but their wise captain restrained them. Leaders must know how to interpret events and respond in the right way. 8. Verse 8. Then David went out after him and called to him, "Your Majesty." Saul turned around, and David bowed down to the ground in respect. And he said, "Why do you listen to people who say that I'm trying to harm you? You can see for yourself that just now in the cave, the Lord put you in my power. Some of my men told me to kill you, but I felt sorry for you and said that I would not harm you in the least, because you were the one whom the Lord chose to be king. Look, my father, look at the piece of your robe that I'm holding. I could have killed you, but instead I only cut this off. This should convince you that I have no thought of rebelling against you or of harming you. You are hunting me down to kill me, even though I have not done you any wrong. May the Lord judge which one of us is wrong. May he punish you for your actions against me, for I will not harm you in the least. You know the old saying, evil is done only by evil people. And so I will not harm you. Look at what the king of Israel is trying to kill. Look at what he is chasing, a dead dog, a flea. David is talking about himself. The Lord will judge, and he will decide which one of us is wrong. May he look into the matter, defend me, and save me from you. So when Saul was far enough away from the cave that it was safe, David left the cave and called to him. By using the title, "My Lord the King," and bowing to the earth, David emphasized what he had said to his men, and he let Saul know that he was not a rebel. Even if you cannot respect the man or woman in office, you must show respect to the office. Where is this at? Romans chapter 13, verse 1 through 7, and 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 through 17. David showed his respect by calling Saul my master, the Lord's anointed, my Lord, the King, and my Father. David's bold public appearance also let Saul and his army know that their official spy system was very, very ineffective. Using the piece of Saul's robe as evidence, David opened his defense by exposing the deception of the courtiers who slandered David to Saul. The logic was irrefutable. You can't deny this. David had the opportunity to kill Saul, but refused to do so. David even admitted that some of his men urged him to slay the king, but he ended up rebuking them. David was not guilty of any evil against Saul or any transgression against the Lord, but Saul was guilty of trying to kill David. "The Lord's will judge between us," said David, "and prove that your officers are liars. But I will not lift my hand against you." Saul had hoped that the hand of the Philistines or the hand of David's soldiers would kill David, but they failed. Ultimately, Saul died by his own hand on the battlefield, chapter 31. David quoted a very familiar proverb at that time to prove his point. Wickedness comes from the wicked, which simply means that character is revealed by conduct. The fact that David did not kill the king indicated that David did not have the character of a rebel or a murderer. But at the same time, David was strongly suggesting that Saul's character was questionable because he wanted to kill his own son-in-law, David. But what was the king really doing as he pursued David? Only chasing a dead dog and a flea that was jumping from one place to another. Remember, fleas and dogs go together. Now, the phrase dead dog was a humiliating term of reproach in those days. So David was humbling himself before the Lord and the king. David closed his defense by saying a second time that the Lord was a righteous judge. Let's go to 16 now. When David had finished speaking, Saul said, "Is that really you, David, my son?" And he started crying. Then he said to David, "You are right, and I am wrong. You have been so good to me, while I have been so wrong to you. Today you have shown how good you are to me, because you did not kill me, even though the Lord put me in your power. How often does someone catch an enemy and then let him go away unharmed? The Lord bless you for what you have done to me today. Now I'm sure that you will be king of Israel, and that the kingdom will continue under your rule. But promise me in the Lord's name that you will spare my descendants, so that my name and my family's name will not be completely forgotten." David promised that he would. Then Saul went back home, and David and his men went back to their hiding place. So King Saul once again revealed his confused mental state. Like I said, bipolar illness, basically, by lifting up his voice and calling to David, who had certainly spoken long enough for Saul to discern that it was indeed his son-in-law, David. As for Saul's weeping, he had manifested temporary emotional reactions like that before, but they never brought about repentance or a change of heart. He never repented. Saul described three possible levels of life: the divine level, where we return good for evil; the human level, where we return good for good and evil for evil; and the demonic level, where we return evil for good. Saul admitted that David was a godly man who, by not killing him, returned good for evil. But Saul was possessed by demonic forces and did evil to the man who would have destroyed him. Now Saul openly confessed that he knew David would be the next king and would consolidate the nation of Israel that Saul had torn apart. But even then, Saul's major concern was his own name and descendants, not the spiritual welfare of the people. He made David swear that he would not wipe out his family when he became king. David made a similar covenant with Jonathan back in chapter 20, and he was willing to make the same promise to Saul. How tragic, that Saul's own sins destroyed his family. All but Jonathan's crippled son, Mephibosheth, whom David adopted. Everybody else was destroyed, killed. But because David knew God's calling and believed God's promise, he was able to be so bold before Saul and his army. It was indeed a holy boldness that came from a heart that was right with God. The day would come when David and his cause would be vindicated, and the Lord would judge those who had opposed David. So Saul went back home to Gibeah, but in spite of his tears and emotional speech, he took up his pursuit of David again in chapter 26. Okay.